Hello and welcome to week 7. So today we are going to be looking at Emperor Hadrian, who is the successor to Trajan. And this is actually going to be a bit of a two-part lecture because Hadrian was really an emperor of the provinces. So today we're going to be looking at Hadrian, similar to how we did with Trajan, in Rome, the things that he built that for himself that were closely associated with himself. But at the end of this lecture and moving into next time, we're going to be expanding into the provinces because he embarked on a very large building campaign in the provinces. And so we're going to kind of expand and look at the things he built out there. But today, as I said, we're going to be looking in Rome. And one of the biggest things, as you can already see, that we're going to be looking at is the Pantheon. So a very exciting lecture. Let's get started. So Emperor Hadrian, he is number 3 of the 5 good emperors. So if you remember that we talked about this pseudo-dynasty, in a way they're a dynasty because we grouped them all together and they did adopt one another, but they were not related, and they weren't solely picking people just because they were related to them. They were really trying to pick the best person for the job, and that worked out pretty well. We get some pretty good emperors. So the 5 good emperors, the first one was Nerva, the second one was Trajan, and the third one is Hadrian. As I said, Hadrian is Trajan's successor. He is also from Spain, and he actually was also related to Trajan. So his father was Trajan's first cousin, so he's kind of one generation removed. And although he is related to Trajan, he also was, as I said, adopted for his merit. So Trajan adopts him. He is, it's right before Trajan dies, so he's about 41. Gets adopted by Trajan, but he's really adopted because of his ability to be a good ruler. So more of a merit-based system. But he is also from Spain, so we have another emperor from the provinces. He's from Spain, which is in the west, but we'll see him having kind of a more fascination with the eastern provinces because he was a Philhellene, or you can also call him a Hellenophile. It's kind of either way, you can put him in reverse order. But a Philhellene means a lover of the Greeks. So Hadrian loved Greek culture. We'll talk a little bit about why that was, but he loved Greek culture. And remember that when we talk about Greek culture in the ancient world, we're not talking about just what we think of as today as the modern nation state of Greece. We're talking about kind of the whole Greek Mediterranean, which included islands, which included parts of Western Turkey. So it's this whole Greek world, even parts of Egypt in a way, because Cleopatra and her ancestors were Greeks that had come into Egypt and begun to rule there. So Egypt also kind of in a way became part of this Greek world. So he really was a lover of the Eastern Mediterranean cultures, but especially the Greeks, and he really admired the classical Greeks. We can also see that he was bearded, which is another reference to his love of the Greeks. We always see emperors who are clean shaven, right? So if we remember Trajan, he looked very much like Augustus, and many emperors in that time frame modeled themselves after Augustus, after Julius Caesar, and they were all clean shaven. Even when we saw depictions of the soldiers on Trajan's column, right, they all were clean shaven. A lot of them have this kind of bowl haircut. And that's the look of a traditional Roman man, right? That was the style. Hadrian is going to totally upend that, and that he is going to always be depicted with a beard. And he likely had a beard his whole life. And it was really a reference to the Greeks, as I said, because if we look at Greek philosophers, if we look at Greek statues from the classical era, they are almost always depicted with beards. So this was very much a part of Greek culture for men to have beards. So we see that with Hadrian adopting that as well. And if you even think back to the paintings at Paestum, I think it was, the tomb paintings, you might remember that we saw some men with beards there, again, a reference to Greek culture. But if we go back just to look at this one more time, so Hadrian is perhaps the emperor who we have the most portraits of. There are tons and tons of portraits of Hadrian that we have, more so than any other emperor. Might be because he was such a man who went into the provinces, and so we see a lot of art out there happening associated with him. But what do we see here? So again, yes, we see a break from the kind of Augustan tradition of being clean shaven, of having that same haircut with those kind of comma-like bangs. He has very curly hair, so we see that here. It's not too dissimilar of a hairstyle, but definitely different that he has curly hair, that beard, and he's in a way, though, although he looks different from Trajan, there is a similarity in kind of their facial expressions. So we're almost in a little bit of a mix where we're not hyper idealized, we're not hyper realistic here. There's some of both in that we see idealization for sure, because if you look at the bare chest, right, the musculature, sort of the cheekbones that you see, these strong features are idealized, and almost a sense of you can't really place how old they are. They could be younger, could be older. It's kind of an in between. So we're not seeing tons of verism, but we're also not seeing quite as much idealization as we saw with Augustus, who really looked very photoshopped, right? We see a couple lines under his eyes here, we see some nasolabial lines, etc. So he, as I said, was 40 years old when he became emperor, so kind of middle-aged, and we see that in his portraits as well. His wife was named Sabine, and here's a portrait of her. We see that she has kind of ditched the Flavian hairstyle, or even the hairstyle that Trajan's wife had, where it was that big coif, right? We see that she has kind of kept it simpler, and she's also wearing a bit of a crown, like a diadem, kind of a tiara, and she is also veiled as well. So we see this in some of her portraiture. Sabine and Hadrian did not have the best marriage. It was kind of an unhappy marriage. And that is probably because the real love of Hadrian's life was Antinous. And Antinous was his travel companion, a lot of people said, for a long time, but we really see him as Hadrian's lover. And so we are thinking that Hadrian probably was gay, that he probably was married, but did not actually love his wife in that way. And we see him much more often associated with Antinous, who was a youth that he met. He was born in one of the eastern provinces and came to Rome at a fairly young age, as a teenager. And Hadrian immediately took a liking to him. And they began to travel together when Hadrian would go out into the provinces. They went to Greece and Egypt, all these places together. And we really do see them having a relationship. We see that Hadrian built a lot of things associated with Antinous, portraits. He had his portrait done, things like that. We also see, though, that Antinous died at quite a young age. So they had a relationship while Antinous was a teenager. He ends up dying at age 19. They are on a trip to Egypt. They are on a boat going down the Nile, and Antinous drowns. And there's still, even to this day, we are not sure why or how, not sure how that happened. There's a lot of different rumors that historians kind of postulated. One of them is that perhaps Hadrian, it was documented that he was in kind of poor health. And there is an idea that maybe Antinous thought by sacrificing himself, he would win favor with the gods, and they would therefore heal Hadrian, that there would be kind of a life for a life thing here. It's also possible that people disliked Antinous, and they disliked the relationship and the kind of attention that Hadrian gave him, and assassinated him. There's also ideas that it could have just been a suicide, that it could have been also any of these other things, an accident as well, an accidental drowning. We really don't know. But what we do see is that although Hadrian was very close to Antinous, after he died, we really see the extent of his affection for him in that he builds even more monuments. He immediately deifies him, which was a bit of a unique move, and that usually, people weren't deified until after their deaths, but usually it was just the emperor and his wife, and that was it. And so the fact that we see someone who is not, necessarily formally part of the imperial family being deified after their death was definitely a sign of how much Hadrian cared for him and wanted him to have a place in Roman society. And we see temples being built to him, and even more portraits actually come out after his death, as you see here, this bust of Antinous as Dionysus. We see, so he died in 130, and so we see that this was created after his death. Hadrian dies in 138. So we know that this bust was created in that kind of interim period. And also, if you look, he is depicted as Dionysus. So he is depicted with this kind of crown, in a way, of leaves and grapes, of like a vine, which is the symbol of Dionysus, right? He's the god of wine. And so we see connections there to his divinity, to this idea that Antinous has been made a god after his death because he has been depicted in the guise of a god. And we'll see that a little bit more later on. And just another note about their relationship and how it kind of developed. As I said, Antinous came to Rome at a young age to be educated, and that is where Hadrian first saw him. And if you think back to when we were talking in Paestum about the tomb paintings of the symposia, and I talked a little bit about this Greek ideal in society where there would be an older man having a relationship with a younger man, right? There would be a romantic relationship between a man older who usually had the beard, right? And then a kind of a teenage boy who was clean shaven. And that's what we see here. And so it's interesting because I've always wondered, was this why Hadrian was so fascinated with Greek culture? But definitely an important part of Hadrian's reign and also his architecture and art that is associated with him is this depiction of Antinous. So Hadrian, as I said, traveled a lot, and also where we saw that earlier emperors were very concerned with building the empire, you know, Trajan's conquest of Dacia, the Flavians' conquest of Judea. We see these conquests happening, this expansion of the empire. What we see with Hadrian is really a maintaining of the empire, and that he wasn't as concerned with growing the empire as he was as keeping the borders that had already been created. And so we don't see a lot of expansion, but we do see a shoring up and a development of the existing provinces. And one of the places that we see that is in Britain. So Britain had been conquered earlier, but Hadrian builds this barrier wall, essentially, in the very, very north of Britain, near the Scottish border today, called Hadrians Wall. And it's kind of like a great wall where it goes for miles and miles, all the way from one sea to the other. And you can still see a lot of it today. A lot of it's well preserved. It wouldn't have been this low in antiquity. It would have been a full wall, but it was kind of quarried and broken down ever since. And so a lot of times we're just left with these lower levels. But there was definitely a military garrison in Britain. We see a lot of Roman British troops there, artifacts associated with the military especially. And so we definitely see this as a defensive wall, as a way to maintain the current borders of the empire from threats in the north, and a kind of a military feature. So just again, this idea of maintaining the existing borders and building architecture and things to help with that, to continue to maintain these borders. You can go see it today. Well, it's all well preserved, so you can go do a little walk along the wall if you'd like. But coming back to Rome, one of the biggest things that Hadrian is known for is the Pantheon. And so we're going to spend a lot of time on this because it is one of the most characteristic buildings of the Roman world, one of the best preserved as well. So some of you may have been there already, and a very important architectural development for both the Roman Empire and Roman history, but also just for architectural history as well. So if you're writing your paper on the development of concrete, definitely pay attention to this part. So the Pantheon, it was rebuilt by Hadrian, so it was not initially built by him, but when it was built over here. So you can see it's in the Campus Martius. It's kind of by the Stadium of Domitian, which we talked about. It's also close to the Mausoleum of Augustus, which is very important, and we'll talk a little bit about that more. But we see it out in the Campus Martius, kind of with these other buildings of imperial construction. And if we see it on a map today, you can actually see that relationship still taking place. So we talked about, when we talked about the Stadium of Domitian, how you can still see the form of it in the Roman city today. And so that's what we're looking at right here. And then you can see the Pantheon is very close to it. And then we also see a kind of a direct access to the Mausoleum of Augustus. So definitely a connection here in these imperial construction projects. And the reason why that might be is because the Pantheon was initially built by Marcus Agrippa. And we didn't talk about him too much, but we did talk about him when we talked about the Era Pacis. Marcus Agrippa was essentially Octavian's right-hand man, Augustus's right-hand man, his best friend. They were around the same age. Marcus Agrippa actually ends up marrying Augustus's daughter, so very closely related. And through that marriage, Marcus Agrippa becomes the ancestor of a lot of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. So we see, some of the grandnephew and nephew things that were happening are actually through the children that Marcus Agrippa had with Augustus's daughter. So Agrippa is the first one to build the Pantheon. And although it's called the Pantheon, which means all gods, so pan is the Greek root meaning all, and then theos is is gods. So Pantheon, it's kind of the place of all the gods. That's what we call it today. And it says, we have a ancient historian who tells us that it has this name of the Pantheon, perhaps because it was decorated with many, many statues and images of all of the gods. But there's also a thought that it could be because it sort of resembled the heavens in its design. So we're not sure exactly if it was used primarily for the worship of all of the gods, if that was its primary purpose, because our historian here goes on to say, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, I'm just going to kind of summarize for you, but he goes on to say that the Pantheon in Marcus Agrippa's time was largely used to venerate Augustus, that we see it really dedicated to Augustus, that Agrippa placed a statue of Caesar and statues of Augustus there. And he says this was not done out of any rivalry or ambition on Agrippa's part to make himself equal to Augustus, but from his hearty loyalty to him and his constant zeal for the public good. So we really see Agrippa making this building in honor of his friend and the Emperor Augustus. So again, we're not really sure exactly what it was used for, but we definitely see imperial connections, that it's not a purely religious building. It's not just to worship all the gods. There's also this element of a connection to the emperor and to kind of worship of the emperor, or at least reverence for the emperor. So it was built, like I said, initially in Marcus Agrippa's time, I believe in the early 1st century CE, but we see that it was updated over the years. There was kind of damage that happened to it. It was rebuilt again under Domitian, and then, as I said, rebuilt again under Hadrian. However, when Hadrian rebuilds it in what year? 118. So 118 is when the construction begins on it under Hadrian. He maintains this inscription on the outside of the building, and it's in Latin, but it says, "Marcus Agrippa, the son of Lucius, 3 times consul, built this." So even though this building is no longer resembling Agrippa's building, doesn't look the same, probably not even the same materials, it really was rebuilt, we still see that Hadrian is dedicating it and honoring Agrippa through this. So we definitely see this idea of memory, of Roman memory, and the importance of connecting yourself to those important figures who have come before you. We see that happening on this building, and that Hadrian wants to connect himself to the reign of Augustus, that he's not totally getting away from that and saying, this is my building now. He's still paying homage to Marcus Agrippa, and therefore to the reign of Augustus. And as we've talked a lot about this, everyone wanted to connect themselves to Augustus. Augustus was kind of the primo emperor that everyone aspired to be. And we see that with Trajan, when his appearance looks a lot like Augustus. We looked at those multiple statues. And so we see it here too, that Hadrian is trying to connect himself still to that dynasty. So let's look a little bit at what the building looks like. So here's the facade. It is a very grand building, as you can see, and the floor level, the street level, actually would have been lower in antiquity. So although we're looking at it straight on, it would have been a little bit lower. And actually, this is actually a pretty good image for what I'm trying to say, which is that you don't see the back of it from when you are standing in front of it. So I'm going to say that again. When you're standing in front of it, you only see the front facade. You can't see the building behind it. You only see, like you have in this left-hand picture, just the front of it with the columns and the pediment. So that's going to be important because it just looks like a temple right now, right? When you're looking at it, it just looks like a normal Roman temple like we've seen. So it has a colonnade in the front. It has a very deep porch. You can see that there's multiple rows of columns here. So we have 1, 2, 3 rows of columns. They are in the Corinthian order. We see a frieze here that has that inscription. We see a pediment. The pediment would have had a depiction of an eagle, perhaps a reference to Augustus or just Rome in general. But it looks fairly like a standard Roman temple front. There might be some Greek influence in that there are 8 columns in the front. So 8 columns, which is quite large for a temple. And the one of the only other temples that we see with an 8-columned facade is the Parthenon in Greece. And as we said, that Hadrian was a Hellenophile. He loved Greek culture. So perhaps his 8 columns that he's putting in the front of the Pantheon is a reference to the Parthenon in Athens. But we see it generally looking like a classic Roman temple with a kind of a frontally oriented axis. We see granite columns. So we see gray granite columns in the front and then rose granite in the back. So if you look, they're a little bit more pinkish in the back. Both of them are imported from Egypt. So again, a reference to the eastern half of the empire, of the provinces. Like we said with Trajan's Forum, the idea of bringing in imported materials kind of hints at the wealth of the empire, the power that you have over this large expanse of territory. And it also would have had, like I said, kind of a court in front of this as well, which would have been a little bit lower. But the thing is that it is not a normal temple at all. So although you're looking at it from the ground level and you're just seeing the columns with the pediment, that what happens is when you walk around the side of it, or more importantly, when you walk inside, you see that it has this massive dome, that it is not a rectangular Roman temple like we've had for centuries, but it actually is a rotunda. So it's round. It's a round building and it's topped with a dome. So definitely again, the idea of experience that we've talked so much about in this class, that these architects are creating an experience for people walking into the building. They're thinking about the sequence of events and how someone is going to experience it. They're thinking about the journey that someone is going to take. The fact that you're going to start outside and you're going to think, oh, I'm just walking into any other temple. And then you're going to walk inside and you're going to see this massive dome that we'll look at in a second. But here's some plans of it. So as you can see, this is the facade of it with that deep porch. You can see those circles are the columns. And then you walk inside and it's a round building. So a round building is called a rotunda. If you think like the Capitol building or something, right, in the US, rotunda, and then it is topped with a dome, and the dome is the one that sits on top. And so you can see that inside the elevation of the dome. So as we kind of move back, as I said, we have this porch, portico, frieze, pediment. There's actually a second pediment behind it. So we see kind of the initial temple front, and then we see this intermediate area where there's this block and then a second pediment that kind of creates almost like a narthex in a way. And then we have the rotunda in the back. And when you walk into that rotunda, what you're going to see is essentially a spherical room, which is really a feat of engineering. So a spherical room, that in the sense that with the dome, if you trace the dome and you look up at it, and again, I'll get to that in a second, when you look up at it, if your eyes continued, the room would make a perfect circle, a perfect sphere, and that the top half could mirror the bottom half. So again, very interesting architecture, very innovative architecture. What we're seeing here is that there's a large cylindrical drum on the bottom. So that's the making the rotunda, making the actual space that you're walking around, this drum. And then what we see is a concrete dome on top of the rotunda. So the diameter of the rotunda is identical to the height of the rotunda, right? Because it's a sphere, so all of the diameters are always going to be the same. So the height from the floor to the top of the dome is the exact same as the width of the rotunda, that's how it makes the sphere. So let's look at the inside. So this is what it looks like on the inside, very lavish. This grand dome over your head, as you can see. So you can kind of see where there's the cylinder on the bottom, and then it's topped with this dome. And you can almost imagine, right, the circle that I was kind of talking about, that circular effect. So how exactly was it built? So the concrete, it is made of concrete. Again, an important development in Roman concrete. The concrete was probably all poured at once. And what happens is that it was thicker at the bottom. So the concrete is thicker on the base, and then it gets thinner as they go toward the top. And it was also kind of a special concrete in that it was mixed with volcanic rock material. And so by pouring concrete onto heavier materials at the bottom, and then that's the volcanic rock. And then as you go up, they used a different type of concrete that was mixed more with travertine and tufa, which are those local rocks to Rome. Those are lighter materials. So you have a lighter concrete structure sitting on top of a heavier concrete structure. And also the walls themselves are also thinner. So that allows this dome to rest on the weight of a heavier base, because again, you don't want the dome falling down. And so it's a way to kind of rest it on top so that it is still supported. This is a very large a dome as well. It is actually it was the widest dome in antiquity at the time, but it is also still to this day the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. So the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world is still this, which was built in 118. We also see that there are marble tiles, so it has a marble floor, and then there are marble tiles on kind of the rotunda part, the cylinder part, and then we see coffers up on the dome. So the coffers, again, those kind of square geometric shapes that create depth. They have depth to them, where it's sort of a tiered square. We also see an oculus. So an oculus we've talked about, I think we maybe first talked about it in the baths at Pompeii, but an oculus is going to be a circle in the ceiling that lets light in. It's this circulus, it's related to the word for eye, so it's kind of the eye of it. And that was to let light in. The oculus is 30 feet in diameter, so just kind of to give you a sense of the size of it, 30 feet in diameter is the oculus. And as the sun moves, the shaft of light that comes through that oculus is also going to move. So as the sun moves across the sky, it's going to cast its light differently through the oculus and again kind of create this experience. It's going to be a different experience at different parts of the day. It also is a way to bridge this indoor space with outdoor space, in that we're letting the natural world into this space, because it's also open to the elements. So rain could come in. There's actually a drain right in the center. So if it did rain, it would drain through. But imagine being in this during something like a thunderstorm, that would be a pretty intense experience. And also if there is, just crazy light happening, it would shine on these different parts of the walls and illuminate different things, different sculptures, maybe different people. So definitely creating this experience. The Pantheon the interior is separated into 3 registers in a way, 3 zones, we call them 3 zones. So there's a lower zone, intermediary, middle zone, and then the top zone, which is the dome. So I kind of want to go through each of those. The lowest zone, as you can see, is filled with kind of alternating columns and niches. And 2 columns, and then a niche with a statue inside. The niches also all have these pediments, so some of them are triangular, some of them are rounded, but the niches, as I said, would have held statues, and we know from that ancient historian who tells us that they would have been statues of all of the gods, but also statues including of Augustus and Julius Caesar, who are at this point deified. We also see some elements of Roman wall painting, although this is not painted, it's marble, but we kind of see these geometric blocks in a way that kind of reference painting styles. And then if we move up one, we see a different register, a different zone, this kind of middle zone here, that also mimics the bottom, and that it also has niches with triangular pediments and then blocks of marble. And then we get to the top, and that is the dome, as I said, with its coffered ceiling, with its oculus. Something else to note about the coffers, although they are in a way a decorative feature, to create that sense of depth, they're also an architectural engineering feature. They're practical, they have a purpose. And that purpose is to lighten also the weight of the dome. So it's a very, very heavy dome. So like I said, with the way that they poured the concrete and then it's going to be thinner and lighter at the top, they also carve these coffers in order to make the dome lighter so that it's not all solid. But by carving these bits out of it, that takes away material and makes it lighter. So the coffers are also very practical here. The coffers would have been painted, so they likely would have been painted dark blue, and then they would have each had a star in the middle. And if you remember, our ancient historian talks about that the ceiling looked like the heavens. And that's what we're seeing here. So the ceiling of it is going to be dark blue and have a star in each coffer, sort of representing the sky. And then you have that oculus where you can actually see the sky. So if it's dark out, then you're seeing stars in the ceiling, and then you look through that oculus and you see actual stars. So again, we're breaking down that barrier between the interior and the natural world, or even the urban and the natural world, and that we're creating a connection with the heavens here. Also, that relates to the idea of a religious experience, the fact that the gods were said to dwell in the heavens. So by making that resemble the heavens, and then with the oculus, you're more in touch with the divine. And that's actually what we are seeing in these different zones of the Pantheon, in that we're seeing kind of an earth world on the bottom, and that's where you're standing, and that's with these columns. It looks more architectural, and that's kind of the world, the earthly world of you know where you are in Rome. And then you look up and you see the dome of the heavens, right, representing the heavens. So we have this connection here, but also this kind of difference between the terrestrial realm and the heavenly realm. This building, if you're standing in it, really would have been an experience. However, it's not just the architecture that creates this experience, but it is also the experience of Hadrian being in this space. So as we said, this was a temple, but we don't really know if it was only a temple. It has other elements that doesn't seem like it was a traditional temple. And one of those is the fact that we know that Hadrian liked to hold court here. So what Hadrian would do is he would sit in the middle of this structure. He would sit in the middle on kind of a throne, and he would place himself in the center of this building. And so, as I said, the fact that we have these different realms connected here, representing these different, you know, the heavenly versus the earthly realm, Hadrian sitting in the middle, he would sit directly under the oculus. And by doing so, the light would come in at certain times of the day and illuminate him, right? Because he's sitting right underneath this light source. And that fills him with light while everything else around him is dark. And that kind of marks him as the center of the universe. And we also see here a big connection with the sun, as other emperors have done, right? So we see, you know, Nero and Sol, but we see emperors, you know, making this connection with the sun as sort of a divine inspiration, or a connection to the divine. And so by Hadrian setting himself in the middle of this space, of this circular space, again, with the statues of the gods around him, with the heavenly dome above him as well, we really see this as not just an experience for the people who are entering to experience the building this way, but Hadrian himself is playing a role in this experience. He's like almost like an actor taking part in this performance of the divine and the divine world meeting the earthly world. So that is the Pantheon, and I just want to emphasize again how much of an accomplishment this was in terms of what the Romans are doing with concrete. And so if we just look at where they have come, right, the fact that they started with the arch, and you saw this, you know, when we talked about the markets of Trajan, that they have that barrel vault, which is just, you know, a long hallway with the arch kind of extending to create a walkway. So you have a barrel vault, a rounded barrel vault above you. They figured out that if you put two barrel vaults together, you get a groin vault. If you put multiple groin vaults together, you can create this sequence and have windows, if it's elevated, that let light in. And then what happens is that we see if these same principles are applied, this idea of shaping concrete upward and using the concrete to support itself, that we can create a dome. And so that is what we're seeing here. The kind of technical term for the Pantheon would be a hemispherical dome with an oculus. And by doing so, they can create this dome, which is resting on this rotunda, and create this experience that I talked about. So if we're putting it all together, you're standing in this court outside, you're looking at it, and you think it's just a normal Roman temple. Then you walk through this really, really deep portico. You see the imported marble, right? You walk through the door and you see this round space. You see this incredibly giant spherical space. You see the light perhaps coming through the oculus and coming directly onto Hadrian, illuminating him. And he's surrounded by these statues of gods and this other lavish material, imported marble on the inside as well. And the dome of the heavens is above him. That it really would have created a magnificent experience for Roman people. And one of the reasons that it is so well preserved today is because it was transformed into a Christian church in about the 7th century. So we see a reappropriation of this building by Christians, and it is actually still an active Christian church today. So you can actually go to church services there if you're in Rome. But definitely a testament to Roman engineering, Roman concrete, abilities and the progress and development that we see of Romans constantly working with concrete to make bigger and bigger things, and this will go on to inspire many other buildings as well, many other domed buildings, and also pushing the limits of how we can use concrete to create complex shapes. So a very important building built by Hadrian. So here we are again. I wanted to show you this map again. So if we were just here, we're at the Pantheon. I wanted to remind you this connection that it's making with the Mausoleum of Augustus, and that we see it was actually facing a different direction when Marcus Agrippa built it. And when Hadrian builds it, he rotates it so that the entrance is facing the Mausoleum of Augustus, so that you can make this linear axis, this direct connection to Augustus, who is now deified, who is this great hero in Roman history, in the sense that maybe as if Hadrian is looking out, even he's surrounded by all these people, he's looking out the entrance, and he's facing the Mausoleum of Augustus in sort of maybe a show of reverence and connection. But what we also see Hadrian build nearby is his own mausoleum. So if the Mausoleum of Augustus is here, the Mausoleum of Hadrian will sit right here across the Tiber on its western bank. This is the Mausoleum of Hadrian. It too was turned into a Christian building later on, and so you might know it by its name, Castel Sant'Angelo. And if you go to Rome today, it's actually more commonly known as this later name, and for its later history, although it was initially built by Hadrian as his mausoleum. So it was built in 123 to 134, so it was similar to Augustus, how he built his own mausoleum. He was planning for where he wanted to be buried, and he chooses this spot, which, as I said, is right on the Tiber. So there's this long bridge that directly connects you to it. You walk across the Tiber, and it's kind of set up in front of you, so you have kind of preparation time. You're getting closer and closer, making this almost pilgrimage to it. We're not sure exactly what it would have looked like in antiquity, because it has been changed since. Similar to the Mausoleum of Augustus, right? We kind of had to guess. There are many possibilities that people have proposed for what this could have looked like, but it was definitely a multi-tiered structure. It was circular, so circular in plan, centrally planned, you can also call it, and that it has a colonnade going all the way around the circle, and that it would have been topped by some other element, either a tholos we see in this one, or a more traditional temple, or some kind of topper for the mausoleum. And also, like Augustus's mausoleum, we see that it would have been for the whole family. So it would have been for all of Hadrian's family, not just himself, but all the people associated with him. And we do see, I just want to point this out again, the similarities between the Mausoleum of Augustus and the Mausoleum of Hadrian. So again, we see Hadrian taking direct inspiration here from Augustus, and the fact that they're both these multi-tiered structures, they're both circular, they're topped by something, they have a colonnade that goes all the way around, these different levels. So definitely similarities, and as I said on the map, they're not that far apart, so it's conceivable that Hadrian was directly influenced by Augustus's mausoleum. So we're going to move now outside of the city of Rome, and we're going to move to Tivoli. So we've talked about Tivoli a couple times before. Tivoli is about 18, 17 miles outside of Rome. And this is where Hadrian is going to build his villa. So we've talked about with other emperors like Tiberius, the fact that they would build these grand imperial villas as kind of getaway homes. They want to get out of the city, go to this big estate, and it would be giant. And Hadrian's especially is huge. It's a huge mansion complex out in Tivoli. So we're going to look at a lot of different things that were built there that are very representative of Hadrian, of who he was. And the first thing that we notice is a heavy use of waterworks and a lot of references to the provinces. So Hadrian loved the provinces, traveled a lot, especially with Antinous, and we see that he after he went on these travels, came back and built his villa to represent things that he had seen on his travels. So we see almost a microcosm of the empire in his villa, so that even though he's not traveling, even though he's just at home, he can be reminded of all of these places that he went and loved to visit. So if we look at this one in particular, this kind of circular island here, that is what we're going to call the Maritime Theater. We don't actually think that it is a theater, but it kind of got that name and the name stuck. We don't know what it was used for, but it was an island surrounded by a circular colonnade, a colonnaded portico. There are wooden bridges that would have connected the interior and exterior rings. And yeah, we're not really sure, but we think that it may have included a library, maybe a triclinium, a bath. So this was kind of one area of the home. And we also see, again, another reference to circular architecture. So maybe another reference to the interplay of the terrestrial and the cosmos. That's usually what circular buildings tend to mean, because they mimic kind of our own world. So perhaps a reference there as well, but this was likely just part of it. But we see a heavy use of waterworks and circular architecture. We also see the canopus and the Seraphim. So we'll talk about both of those. This is the sort of the canopus side of it, and it was a long pool, essentially, a long cylindrical shaped pool. It would have been also rung by a portico and a colonnade of columns with these arches that would have held statues, as you can see, and then there also would have been statues in the middle of the pool. And this was a reference to Egypt. So the Canopus is actually a city in Egypt, which was on the Nile and kind of included this canal that connected to the Nile. So this pool that we're seeing here is a reference to that canal. And also it held the one in Egypt, the city in Egypt held a sanctuary to Serapis. And Serapis is a Greco-Egyptian god, so not one of the original Egyptian gods from thousands of years ago, sort of a newer god that was incorporated into the Pantheon and mainly worshipped in Egypt. But he had a sanctuary to him nearby Canopus, and so we see that also being built in Hadrian's Campus in Italy. So we have this long pool that represents the canal, and then at the end we have the Seraphim, which is going to reference the sanctuary of Serapis in Egypt. So it's likely that Hadrian visited this place in Egypt and came back and decided to build his own miniature version of it on his land at his villa. So we also see that the pool would have been rung, as I said, by a colonnade, and you can see that they actually would have been caryatids, which we've talked about a couple times. Those were columns that were sculpted to look like women. Augustus had brought some of them. He had them in his forum, but they are originally from the Acropolis in Athens, and they would have been on the Erechtheion there. And so this, the use of caryatids is usually a reference to Greece and specifically Athens. So we see references to Greece as well as Egypt here. The Serapeum at the end would have been a dining complex, so it would have been used as a dining room, kind of like a triclinium. And again, it would have sat at the end of that pool. It was a rounded structure, so kind of a half circle, and then it would have had a little mini dome. And then the back is a more rectangular chamber where the couches would have been, and one where they would have actually ate. It was kind of nice, right? You can sit in this dining room, you can look out over the pool, and you can almost imagine that you are in Egypt, that you are back there, when really you're just a couple miles outside of Rome. I mentioned Tiberius's villa earlier, right? And we see a lot of similarities to his actual villa in Hadrian's Villa. So we have this same idea of kind of this rounded dining room that is sitting on the water. So we saw the grotto at Sperlonga, the dining room there, which had those massive Hellenistic style sculptures. And we see a similar thing here with a dining room kind of on a grotto as well. And we actually do see, in a way, similar sculptures in that we see references to Greek mythology as we did in Tiberius's villa at Hadrian's Villa. So one of the statues or the sculptures that would have stood in the pool was one of Scylla, who there was actually one at the grotto in Sperlonga as well. So similarities between emperors here. Perhaps Hadrian was inspired by Tiberius's villa and wanted to build his own. We also see a lot of sculpture in the Serapeum, in that dining room complex, that looks very Egyptian. So once again, Hadrian is trying to recreate this Egyptian trip. He's trying to make you feel like you're in Egypt, that he and his friends are back in Egypt hanging out. And so we see these very Egyptian style sculptures, and you can tell that they look Egyptian because they're made with that black marble, and that black marble is very characteristic of Egyptian statuary. It also doesn't look very naturalistic or classical. It's very rigid, so the body proportions are not as natural. They're more rigid. You see them with their arms at their sides quite rigidly, just staring forward. They're not looking in either direction. And also the stance of their legs, they're not in the contrapposto pose. pose. They're in a sort of frontally oriented, very rigid pose, and that is very Egyptian. So we also see references, as I said, with Serapis to Egyptian gods in the statuary here. So very Egyptian inspired. Where we also see some references to Egypt is in depictions of Antinous. So we know that Antinous and Hadrian spent a lot of time at this villa together, but after Antinous died, Hadrian continued to build things in his honor and actually built things at the villa in his memory, perhaps commemorating the time that they had spent there. And even more so, it was significant because Antinous died, as I said earlier, on the Nile. So he died in Egypt, and then he was deified. And so earlier we saw this bust of him. We saw it, and this is from Hadrian's Villa. So this one that I showed you, where he looks very much like Dionysus, right? So he is kind of taking on the guise of this god with the headdress here, and also the flowing hair is a bit Dionysian as well. But we also see images of him as Egyptian gods. So this is also from Hadrian's Villa. So we have lots of statuary of him. But he here looks like Osiris, which is an Egyptian god, and he's wearing the headdress that Egyptian royalty would wear. He even looks a bit like in the Egyptian style, the statue itself, and the fact that he's facing forward. Very often we see Antinous looking downward, perhaps as a representation that he has died, and so he's not with you in this world. He's not looking right at you like he could be real, but he looks down. But here we see him looking straight ahead, sort of in that rigid Egyptian style. So we see lots of art dedicated to Antinous. We also see something that we call the Antennae, and that aeon always denotes a temple, essentially. So it's some kind of religious space. So this was part of a temple to Antinous, but it also may have been his tomb. It may have been a whole tomb complex that Hadrian built for him. And we see it also looking very Egyptian. So it would have held palm trees, which are kind of always a reference to the desert and to that part of the world. We see that it may have had an obelisk in the center, and then also would have been rounded and had more traditional Roman forms too. So we think that this was probably, as I said, a center of kind of the cult of Antinous that was created after his death when he was deified, but may have also been his resting place in Hadrian's Villa. So another sign of his affection for Antinous. So we're going to move now outside of Italy, outside of Rome, and start our look at the provinces. And we're going to do that by looking at one of Hadrian's favorite cities, Athens. So Athens is in Greece. As you know, we've talked about, I think it was a big capital of the Greek world in the 5th century BC. And so in the classical era really was rooted in Athens, especially with the great temples of the Acropolis. So it was definitely a Mediterranean power back in the day. At this point, it is a province under the Roman Empire. And what Hadrian does is he visits the city multiple times on his travels around the empire, and he finances the construction of works there. And you can imagine that perhaps not a lot has been done because they don't have as much wealth as they did in the past. And so he's lending imperial money so that things can be built in the city. So we're going to look at a few things that he built, but perhaps one that's most associated with him is this Arch of Hadrian. So this sat kind of on the outskirts of the city. It would have been connected to the wall, and it was actually a gate that went in and out of the city. And what we see on it is that it faces two very important monuments. So if you look at the right-hand picture, we're standing on the eastern side of the gate. We're looking through the gate and we're looking west. And in the distance, you can see this hill is the Acropolis. So you can see the temples of the Acropolis almost through the gate. A note about the gate. So the gate is kind of like an arch, almost like a triumphal arch that we've seen, although it's less for ceremonial purposes and more for practical purposes. It has one large archway in the middle for people to walk in and out. It has some decorative features, and it would have had more on the top that no longer survive, but it kind of has this temple-esque construction on the top with a pediment and Corinthian columns. So a nice lavish structure financed by the emperor. So as I said, we are looking through on the right-hand side. We're standing on the east, looking west, seeing the Acropolis. On the left-hand side here, we're standing on the other side of it. So we're standing on the western side of the gate and we are looking east. And what we were to see through that gateway is the Olympeion. And the Olympeion is also called the Temple of Olympian Zeus. And this is actually, in a way, a classical building in that it was started in 520 BC. So that's really early even for Athens, because the temples on the Acropolis weren't built until 450 BC or so. So 520 BC, it was initially started, but it was never finished. In hundreds of years, no one could ever finish it, until Hadrian comes to Athens and decides to put up imperial money to build it. And it becomes a giant, massive, massive temple, one of the biggest in the Mediterranean. It's not much is left of it today. You can see some columns broken down on the ground, as well as some standing, but I mean, it's a huge, almost like a park. And you can see its scale here with the rest of Athens today. And you can actually see in this image, there you go, there is the Arch of Hadrian. So you can imagine that if you're standing right here and you're looking through, you have a direct look at this building that was a huge building, as I said, very grand and totally financed by Hadrian. So although it's an old work, it's now associated with Hadrian, that he was the one to get this done in 131. And so what we have here is in a way, Hadrian almost adopting the city of Athens and almost making it his own. By building these construction works, he is kind of taking ownership of it in a way. And we see that by the inscription that is on Hadrian's gate. So if you are looking, east, if you're facing the Olympion, then what you have on this side, so on this side of the gate, you know, you're on the Acropolis side of the gate. The Acropolis is behind you. So if there's kind of, the gate is acting as a barrier, you're on the Acropolis side. The inscription says, "This is Athens, the ancient city of Theseus." And Theseus was a hero of myth. He was the one who fought the Minotaur, but he was also said to have roots in Athens. So he was from Athens, and he was very closely connected to the city in antiquity. He was kind of their golden boy. He was like their hometown hero of myth, Theseus. So this is Athens, the ancient city of Theseus, referring to the Acropolis side, to the old city. But on the other side of the gate, on the gate side, the side of the gate that's on the Olympion side, it says, "This is the city of Hadrian and not of Theseus." So here we're seeing, again, this reclaiming of the city, and that Hadrian is sort of adopting Athens for himself. And where there was once this mythical hero, Theseus, who was the city's golden boy, their hero now is kind of Hadrian, because of the work that he's put into the city, the way that he's dedicated himself to it and put up construction works there. And so we start to see this switch, not just with Hadrian also, but in the sense of Roman imperial power, that we see monuments to Roman imperial power in provinces, and a sense of ownership that Rome is taking over these cities, some of which had been in existence for a long time and had been flourishing for a long time. We see the Romans come in and start to alter them, start to make their own mark and adopt them for themselves, and kind of also take some of the credit here, and that they're building up the city again, and that allows them to take ownership. So that's where we're going to leave it for today. We're going to actually continue our look at Hadrianic Athens in the next lecture. So we're not done yet. This is kind of an unfinished lecture, but we'll continue to look more at Hadrian and the provinces next time, as well as the provinces at large. And then that'll be the Eastern provinces, and the lecture after that next week, we will be looking at the Western provinces. So exciting stuff coming up. So see you next time.